A house can hold many things: memories, regrets, and sometimes a silence too heavy to name. In today's story, a scarf left behind and a flower blooming out of season hint at a truth buried in love and loss. You'll want to listen closely, because not every secret is meant to be uncovered. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The Scarf That Didn't Belong. Jessica Fletcher stepped from the hired car and stood still for a moment, her gaze lifting to the ivy-clad gables of Wexley House. The estate was grand, though softened by age, window frames dulled by years of salt-laden wind, shutters hanging just slightly askew. It was the sort of place where memories lingered in corners and footsteps echoed a little too long. Eleanor Wexley had written her 2 months prior, a short, elegant letter recalling their distant acquaintance from a writers' conference in Maine, followed by an unexpected invitation. "Do come visit, Jessica. The house is too quiet, and I find myself longing for conversation with someone of sense." Jessica, having recently submitted her latest manuscript, accepted without hesitation. She felt the need, too, for stillness, the kind only old houses and faded friendships seemed to offer. The front door opened as she approached. A tall, soft-voiced man greeted her with polite reserve and introduced himself as Lucian, Eleanor's personal assistant. He led her through a hushed foyer lined with oil portraits, their eyes following like silent sentinels. "She'll be waiting in the morning room," he said, gesturing gently. Jessica nodded, placing a hand on the polished banister as they passed. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a scent she knew well. There was something at once peaceful and uncertain in the air, like a song whose final note hadn't quite resolved. She smiled to herself, not unkindly. Wexley House, it seemed, had its own story waiting to be told. Eleanor Wexley sat in a high-backed chair, framed by pale winter light, filtering through gauzy curtains. Her features, though lined with age, retained the composure of someone used to being listened to. "My dear Jessica," she said, with a warmth that just skirted fragility, "you look precisely as I remember, though I dare say you've aged better than I." Jessica smiled. "You always did exaggerate, Eleanor." Tea was served promptly, by Lucian, still silent and precise, and soon joined by 2 others, Margot, Eleanor's niece, with sharp cheekbones and a sharper glance, and Mrs. Tatlow, the housekeeper, who offered a restrained smile before retreating to the edge of the room, like a servant from another century. "Margot has just returned from a brief sabbatical in Florence," Eleanor explained, gesturing toward her niece. "Hardly a sabbatical," Margot murmured. "More of an escape." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward her with a private warning. Jessica noted it, along with the quick downward turn of Lucian's mouth. They spoke of books, travel, and weather, but beneath the easy civility, Jessica sensed undercurrents, small silences, loaded glances. It wasn't rudeness, it was something more delicate, something bruised. Later, after being shown to her room and freshening up, Jessica found herself wandering the hallway that led to the drawing room. The house had a quiet rhythm, a whisper rather than a hum, and she walked with measured steps, careful not to disturb it. The drawing room door stood slightly ajar. She nudged it open and stepped inside. The room was grand, with high ceilings and worn elegance. Embroidered cushions softened the antique settee, and a grand piano stood mute in the corner. On the mantelpiece rested a cluster of framed photographs, their edges slightly silvered with age. But what caught Jessica's eye was something much simpler. Draped over the arm of a wingback chair close to the unlit fireplace lay a scarf. Ivory-colored, light wool. Its placement was strange, not folded, not flung in haste, simply there, as though waiting to be claimed. She moved closer. It was delicately scented, faintly floral. Not Eleanor's style, she thought, nor Margot's, who had worn something far bolder that afternoon. She didn't touch it, but something about it sat oddly in her mind, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture. Jessica left the room quietly, her curiosity stirred. As dusk settled over the estate, Jessica found Eleanor seated in the library with a glass of sherry and a tired smile. The older woman gestured to the chair beside her, and Jessica joined her without a word. "Does the house overwhelm you?" Eleanor asked, voice low and smooth. "Not at all," Jessica replied. "It reminds me of a story half-written, beautiful, but waiting for something to happen." Eleanor laughed, though it was brief and hollow. "You always were poetic." They spoke quietly, about the passage of time, about Eleanor's late husband who had passed nearly 8 years ago, and about the loneliness that trickled in despite good company and grand surroundings. "You've kept the house in fine order," Jessica said. Eleanor tilted her head. "I've kept it standing. Whether that counts as fine, well, I leave that to kinder judges." She sipped her drink, eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the windows. "There are days, Jessica, when silence feels like the loudest thing in a room." Jessica said nothing. She simply reached for her own glass and held it gently. Sometimes, kindness was best offered in stillness. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, an old walnut table set with silver that gleamed a little too brightly, as though recently polished in a hurry. Jessica sat between Eleanor and Margot, opposite Lucian and Mrs. Tatlow. The table was round enough for comfort, long enough for distance. The meal began in civility: roasted game hen, a mushroom soufflé, an aromatic claret. Conversation fluttered. Politics, travel, a book Jessica had recently reviewed. "Florence was restorative, was it?" Eleanor asked, her voice light. Margot paused, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Restorative? Perhaps. I found it clarified a few things." "About art?" Eleanor offered. Margot dabbed her lips with her napkin. "About family." An awkward silence followed, broken only by the soft scrape of Lucian's fork. Jessica caught a flicker of discomfort, pass through his expression, quickly buried. Across the table, Mrs. Tatlow cleared her throat and said something about the camellias blooming early this year. Margot glanced at her sharply. "You always did fuss over the garden, didn't you?" she said. "I take pride in what I tend," Mrs. Tatlow replied, voice cool. Jessica watched Eleanor's hands, not trembling, but rigid against the edge of her plate. The atmosphere was not hostile, but strained, like linen stretched too tightly across a table. It was, Jessica thought, the kind of tension that wasn't new. It had simply grown used to hiding in plain sight. The house had quieted by evening's end. Jessica, restless after the long meal, stepped into the hall for a final stroll before bed. Wexley House at night was a different creature, its warmth withdrawn, its walls steeped in hush. She passed the drawing room again, drawn by something faint and fleeting. The window to the garden stood ajar, not wide, just enough for the wind to whisper through. Curtains shifted in the breeze, pale as ghosts in the moonlight. She stepped inside. The same scarf remained on the chair's arm, but now its end moved slightly, stirred by the wind, almost as if it were alive. Jessica approached and gently closed the window, latching it with care. Then she stood still, considering who had opened it. The air outside was cold, not the sort to welcome indoors, and the scarf, it still didn't belong. There was no sound behind her, no movement. just the faint scent of garden air and something floral, sweet but unfamiliar. Jessica turned and left, walking slowly back toward her room. Her thoughts trailed behind her like shadows. Something had shifted, quietly, nothing she could name, not yet. But the house had begun to breathe differently. The dining room was awash in soft winter light, filtered through high, narrow windows. The breakfast table, though beautifully arranged, carried an odd silence, not the comfortable hush of early risers, but something more brittle, more deliberate. Jessica stirred her tea slowly, watching the others over the rim of her cup. Eleanor was already seated, her posture immaculate, her expression politely detached. Lucian stood by the window, pretending to study the frost-laced hedgerows beyond. Margot arrived late, with an apology no one asked for, and took her seat without a glance toward her aunt. The only sound was the faint clink of china and the ticking of the long case clock in the corner. "Will you be walking the gardens today, Jessica?" Eleanor asked with measured grace. "I might. The air looks cold but clear. Wear something warm," Lucian said, his tone gentle, almost too gentle, as if guarding against a crack in the room's porcelain calm. Margot spread marmalade with mechanical precision. "You always did love keeping guests busy, Aunt Eleanor." No one responded. Jessica smiled faintly. She had entered households like this before, rooms that seemed peaceful on the surface, but throbbed with unresolved tension just beneath. This one, she suspected, was barely holding together. Jessica rose not long after breakfast, and wandered toward the east hallway, guided by curiosity more than intention. The corridor was lined with cabinets, old dressers, and the occasional closed door, the kind of hallway that had collected secrets over time. A muffled voice caught her attention. As she turned the corner, she saw Mrs. Tatlow and Mr. Holden, the gardener, standing near a narrow cabinet at the end of the hall. They weren't arguing, exactly, but their tones were clipped and hushed. "I told you I don't have it," Mrs. Tatlow said, not quite whispering. "You were the last to use it." "Eleanor told me herself," Holden replied, keeping his voice low but firm. "The drawer was already locked when I checked." Holden's eyes narrowed. "Strange. It wasn't yesterday." Jessica made no attempt to hide her approach, but their conversation ended instantly. Mrs. Tatlow straightened her apron, while Holden nodded tersely and excused himself down the servants' stair. "Just a bit of confusion over keys," Mrs. Tatlow said with a practiced smile. "You know how old houses are." Jessica nodded, though she said nothing. Something about their exchange had been off, rehearsed, even, and old houses, in her experience, rarely lost keys without someone misplacing the truth along with them. Later that morning, Jessica found Eleanor in the conservatory, seated beside a pot of pale orchids, their blossoms curving like porcelain tears. At Eleanor's invitation, they took a slow walk through the garden paths. The gravel crunched softly beneath their shoes. "It's beautiful here," Jessica said. "It was my husband's dream, not mine," Eleanor replied, pausing beside a leafless cherry tree. "But I learned to love it, eventually." Jessica studied her. "You don't strike me as someone who grows attached easily." Eleanor gave a small, dry laugh. "You're not wrong." They walked a few steps further in silence. The hedges, still green despite the season, curved like quiet sentinels around them. "Lucian seems devoted," Jessica offered gently. "He's been here nearly 20 years, longer than Margot." There was an edge beneath the surface of the words. Not unkind, but undeniably sharp. Jessica watched her hostess's face. It was composed, but only just. "And Margot?" Eleanor looked away. "She reminds me of someone I once was, before I learned the cost of longing." There was a stillness in her tone that didn't invite further questions. Jessica tucked the phrase away. The cost of longing. Some stories revealed themselves not through confession, but through the quiet ache in the things left unsaid. Jessica found Margot alone in the music room later that day, half-seated on the piano bench, a cigarette held in fingers that trembled just slightly. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving the room half warm, half forlorn. "Is smoking allowed?" Jessica asked gently, stepping into the doorway. Margot shrugged without looking up. "No one's tried to stop me yet." Jessica sat beside her. The keys were dusty, untouched. "You play?" "Not anymore. My mother did." This was her space. Jessica waited. Sometimes silence was an invitation. "She died when I was 16. Margot continued, voice flat. "Eleanor took me in, raised me, clothed me, fed me, the full performance." "That doesn't sound like gratitude." Margot glanced at her. "I was a duty, Jessica, a name on a will, a name she couldn't ignore. And now, I'm tolerated until I become useful." Jessica studied her profile, the clenched jaw, the weary posture. "You feel left out of something." "I am." She's been rewriting her will again. Lucian knows. Probably Mrs. Tatlow too. It's like waiting to find out which part of the house I'm allowed to keep after she's gone. Jessica reached for the cigarette box and turned it slowly in her hand. Sometimes it isn't the inheritance that wounds, it's the implication. Margot looked at her then, truly looked. "You're very good at peeling things back." "I write mysteries," Jessica said softly. "I've learned most truths hide in plain sight." Margot's smile came and went like a flicker. "Then you're in the right house." Jessica passed the west corridor on her way back to the library and paused. The hallway was narrower here, the wallpaper slightly darker, as if it had absorbed 100 years of secrets. Several doors lined the walls, not bedrooms but storage perhaps. Each had a solid brass lock, not delicate latches, but heavy, old-fashioned padlocks, the kind that suggested a very deliberate need for privacy. One in particular had fresh scratches around the keyhole. Jessica stepped closer, noticing the faint scent of camphor and something older, paper perhaps, or aging fabric. She touched the edge of the door gently, then stepped back. It wasn't her place to pry, not yet, but the sheer number of locks felt excessive. Down the corridor, Lucian's voice echoed faintly from the stairwell. He was speaking to someone, likely Mrs. Tatlow, but his tone was clipped, irritated. Jessica lingered just a moment longer, then turned away. A house this grand didn't lock things away for safety, it locked them away for memory, and perhaps, Jessica thought, for guilt. Afternoon light slanted across the second floor when Jessica returned upstairs. As she approached Eleanor's study, the door was closed, but voices carried through, sharp despite the effort to contain them. "I won't let you rewrite history." Margot's voice rang out, brittle with fury. "You don't understand what was at stake," Eleanor replied, her tone quieter but no less resolute. "I do understand. That's the point. You think I've forgotten." A pause, and then Eleanor's voice again, not angry, but edged with sorrow. "It wasn't meant for you to carry." Jessica moved quietly past the door, her footsteps soundless against the old carpet. She had no wish to intrude, not now. But every word etched itself into her thoughts, like ink on paper. Rewrite history, forgotten, meant for you to carry. When she reached the staircase, she paused. The house was a chorus of restrained emotion, and its rooms were thick with things that had never been said aloud. Some truths, she suspected, weren't buried. They were simply locked away, waiting for someone to listen at the right moment. Evening fell slowly over Wexley House, casting long shadows across the landing. Jessica, on her way to the library, paused when she saw Lucian standing at the far end of the hall. He wasn't moving, only watching, his gaze fixed on the closed door of Eleanor's room. His face was unreadable, no grief, no affection, just stillness, like someone listening to an echo only he could hear. Jessica remained where she was, unnoticed, for several seconds, then Lucian blinked, turned abruptly, and disappeared into the adjoining hall. She walked on without calling after him. Some silences were louder than arguments, and some gazes too still, too long, said more than any spoken defense ever could. The morning greeted Jessica with an unfamiliar hush. She sat up in bed, blinking against the grey light creeping in through the high windows. A faint chill lingered in the room, despite the house's usual warmth. She reached for her robe, pulled it tight, and listened. No footsteps in the hall, no soft clatter of china from the breakfast table downstairs, no rustle of the newspaper or hum of Mrs. Tatlow's brisk instructions. Something was missing, not in sound alone, but in rhythm. She checked the clock on the mantel, nearly 8:30, far from early in a household that had, until yesterday, stirred like clockwork by 7. Jessica moved quietly through the upstairs hallway, still no one. The usual morning greetings, Lucian with his folded paper, Eleanor's soft voice calling from the breakfast room, were absent. A faint unease settled over her shoulders like the cold, the kind of silence that wasn't restful. It was expectant, listening. Her steps slowed as she descended the stairs. The scent of ash clung faintly to the air, not fresh smoke, but the ghost of fire. Somewhere below, a hearth had burned longer than it should have. She followed it. The corridor leading to the sitting room was dim, shadows lying long across the rug. Jessica reached the corner, and paused. The sitting room door was ajar, only slightly, as if someone had left it in haste, and not returned, and from within, a flicker of orange firelight. She approached slowly, her hand brushing the cold brass of the doorknob. "Eleanor?" she called softly. No answer. She pushed the door open. The fire had died to a low glow, a few stubborn embers pulsing beneath blackened logs. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in dusky amber. Jessica took a hesitant step forward, her eyes adjusting. Then she saw her. Eleanor sat in the high-backed armchair near the hearth. Her posture was oddly regal, upright, composed, as though she were waiting for something. But the stillness was wrong. Jessica's breath caught. Something hung at Eleanor's neck, pale fabric twisted loosely, almost tenderly, the ivory scarf. The same one Jessica had seen draped over the arm of the chair 2 nights ago. She moved no further. Her instinct, honed over years, told her enough. Eleanor Wexley was no longer among the living, and someone had left her carefully posed by firelight that had burned too long. Jessica stood frozen, absorbing the delicate horror before her. Eleanor's face bore no expression of pain, only an eerie serenity. Her eyes were closed, lips gently parted. One hand rested in her lap, the other hung limply by her side. The scarf, that same ivory scarf, soft and harmless-looking, was wound around her neck. Not tightly, almost lovingly, but the line beneath her jaw, just above the edge of her collar, told the truth. A faint red mark, as if something had pressed or held her in place. Jessica's gaze moved methodically across the room. Nothing appeared overturned or out of place. A cup rested on the side table, half full of tea, cold. A book lay open beside it. The scene was one of peace, deliberate peace. She stepped forward now, slowly, respectfully. Not to touch, only to understand. The fire had been fed after midnight. The logs were too fresh, too whole to have been left from the previous evening. Someone had been here with her, or had come after. Jessica's eyes returned to the scarf. It was the detail that refused to let go. Why would Eleanor wear it again? Why not the plum-colored one from dinner? Unless she hadn't put it on herself. From behind her, a creak of floorboard echoed faintly in the hallway, someone approaching or retreating. Jessica turned her head but saw no one. The fire hissed softly, and the morning, which should have begun with warmth and routine,
had opened instead into silence and death.
Lucian arrived first. Jessica had sent word through the house, quietly, calmly.
No shouting, no panic.
She stood back as he entered the sitting room. His eyes locked on Eleanor's still form, and for a moment he did not move. Then a step closer, then two. "No," he breathed. It wasn't loud, not a cry of grief, but disbelief drawn thin by years of silent devotion. He turned away, one hand over his mouth. Margot followed shortly after, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm far too brisk. When she saw her aunt, she stopped. Her expression faltered, then rearranged itself. Sorrow, confusion, restraint. It was a performance, Jessica thought, but not an unfeeling one. Margot's grief was complicated. Mrs. Tatlow gasped aloud, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh dear God," she whispered. "She was just here last night, laughing." Holden stood just inside the door, hat in hand, his face carved from stone. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered not on the body, but on the scarf. Jessica watched them all. Their reactions were varied, human, unguarded, and telling. Grief did not always arrive honestly. Sometimes it waited behind silence or rehearsed gestures. Sometimes it simply turned away. The local authorities arrived within the hour, a measured, quiet presence led by Sergeant Mallory, a tall, middle-aged man, with a patient gaze and a voice too even for the moment. He examined the room slowly, making careful notes. He asked no more than necessary. Not yet. When he approached Jessica, he offered her a respectful nod. "You were the first to find her, I understand." Jessica confirmed this. "She looked at peace," she said gently, but something about it felt too composed. Mallory raised a brow. "You suspect foul play." "I don't suspect," Jessica said softly. "Not yet, but I do question." He gave a non-committal nod. "There's no sign of struggle, no wounds, no blood. Could have been a stroke." "Possibly, though I'd be curious to know what the coroner says about the bruising beneath the scarf." That caught him. He glanced toward the hearth. "The scarf?" Jessica nodded. "It was draped over a chair yesterday afternoon. Today it's tied at her neck. Neatly, but not by accident." Mallory said nothing for a moment, then scratched a note on his pad. Jessica folded her arms lightly. This wasn't hysteria. This wasn't panic. But it wasn't natural either. This death had been arranged. And not only for comfort. While Sergeant Mallory continued his preliminary questions, Jessica moved closer to the hearth. The fire had mostly died, but the heat still radiated gently from the stone, surprising given the hour. She crouched slightly, extending a cautious hand toward the grate. The logs were barely charred, with edges still whole. One had split recently, a sharp pop in the grain, not the softened crumble of long-burning wood. Someone had tended the fire well after midnight. She straightened slowly, glancing back toward the others. Most of the household claimed to have retired early. Margot before 11, Mrs. Tatlow even earlier. Lucian had supposedly checked on Eleanor at 10:30. But this fire said otherwise. Someone had been here. Someone had lingered, not to warm themselves. No, to linger beside her. Or perhaps, to say goodbye. Jessica's breath caught just slightly, or worse, to wait for her to die. The scarf had never left Jessica's mind. It was the detail that refused to settle, too pale, too soft, and far too deliberate. Now, as she studied it once more around Eleanor's neck, the unease returned, stronger. She leaned closer. The fabric was the same light ivory wool she'd seen draped over the armchair 2 evenings prior, a piece that didn't match Eleanor's usual sharp-tailored wardrobe. There had been something too casual, too anonymous about it. She glanced toward Margot, seated now beside the window, arms folded. "Did your aunt wear that scarf often?" Margot looked up, frowning. "That one? No. I'd never seen it until this morning." Lucian from across the room added quietly. She preferred darker colors, jewel tones, not white. Jessica nodded. The scarf had reappeared, but it had not belonged. Someone had chosen it. Someone had returned it to the scene not as a token of affection, but as a message, or a misdirection. She stepped back slowly. This scarf was not an afterthought. It was a signature, and whoever had left it behind knew exactly what it would do. The household had taken on a muffled quiet in the wake of Eleanor's death. Not silence, but something heavier. Footsteps were slower, voices lower. Even the ticking of the foyer clock seemed more pronounced. Lucian approached Jessica in the hallway, his tone both formal and tender. "Miss Fletcher, if you'd like to collect your things, you may use Mrs. Wexley's sitting room. It was her private space, but I think she would have wanted you to feel at home." Jessica offered a nod of thanks, though part of her suspected Eleanor had never truly invited anyone into that room, not emotionally, at least. The sitting room was tucked at the end of the east wing, small but elegant, with soft-toned wallpaper and a pair of chairs by the window. Everything had been carefully placed, the sort of room designed for composure, not comfort. Jessica crossed to the writing desk. She had left a book there the previous evening, a mystery she had been reading for leisure, but her attention shifted almost immediately to the objects Eleanor had left behind. There was a stillness in the room that didn't feel like death. It felt like waiting for someone to read what was never spoken aloud. Jessica moved toward the mantelpiece, where a collection of photographs stood, most in silver or gold frames, all carefully aligned. They chronicled the expected milestones, holidays, gatherings, formal events, but one stood apart. It was older, the frame duller, the glass smudged slightly with dust. The photograph showed a much younger Eleanor, perhaps in her late 20s, seated beside a man with a gentle expression and strong, steady hands. They weren't touching, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. Her smile was fuller then, less guarded. His gaze, however, was entirely fixed on her. Jessica studied his face, dark hair, high cheekbones, something almost familiar, yet she could not place him among the people she had met in the house. There was no name inscribed, no date. She glanced again at the more recent photographs. In none of them did this man appear, not at holidays, not even in the background. Jessica had a practiced eye for omission. This man, whoever he was, had been removed from the story, deliberately. A lover? A brother? A mistake? The dust had not settled by accident. Some memories, she thought, weren't forgotten, only set aside, so that no one else would think to ask. Jessica turned toward the writing desk. It was small, walnut, with delicate carvings along the edge, clearly well cared for. She tried the center drawer, expecting resistance, but the brass pull slid open easily. Inside were folded stationery, envelopes, and a fountain pen that had run dry. Beneath these, a thin leather-bound journal lay, worn at the spine. Eleanor's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, elegant. The entries were sparse and dated only by season, Last winter, early spring, this past August, Jessica read in silence. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I've forgiven, yes, but I still wake with her name in my mouth. Margot deserves something more, but I cannot rewrite the story for her, only leave her what I never said. And then again, Clara, always Clara. I told myself she had no claim, but perhaps it was me who had none. Jessica blinked slowly, letting the name settle. Clara, it appeared 3 times, underlined once. No context, no surname, no explanation, just the suggestion of something once vital, now faded. Jessica placed the journal carefully back in the drawer. Whatever Eleanor had lost, or hidden, Clara had been at the center of it. Tucked beneath the journal, wrapped in a band of yellowing silk, were 3 sealed envelopes. Jessica lifted them gently. The paper was thick, expensive, but beginning to show its age. Each envelope bore a name in Eleanor's crisp handwriting, Margot, Lucian, and one simply marked, "For her." She hesitated. These were not addressed to be mailed. They were private, personal, perhaps never meant to be read, but they were here, accessible, and Eleanor had left no instructions forbidding their discovery. Jessica opened the one marked Margot. The letter was short, its tone clipped, almost businesslike. "I know you believe I never truly welcomed you. That is fair. I didn't. You reminded me of too much, not of your mother, but of myself, before I lost the right to be proud. If I seemed cold, it was because I feared giving you the affection I had once misused." She folded the letter, heart heavy. Next, Lucian's. "You gave me dignity when I had none left to claim. For that, I thank you. I do not leave you money, I leave you silence, and I hope it brings peace rather than punishment." Jessica placed both letters aside and turned to the final envelope. "For her, not Margot. Not Clara, unless..." She did not open it. Not yet. The absence of a name said everything. Whoever she was, she had been the ghost in every word Eleanor left behind. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet near the window, beneath a folded shawl, Jessica found a small wooden box, hand-painted, chipped at the corners. It opened with a quiet creak. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a scarf. Not the ivory one from the sitting room, nor the plum Eleanor had worn at dinner. This one was older, pale blue, its weave slightly frayed, the fabric soft with time and use. The edge was embroidered with tiny white blossoms, one corner loose where the thread had come undone. Jessica unfolded it slowly. The scent that rose was faint, lavender and cedar, long absorbed. It was a keepsake, that much was clear, worn not for style, but for memory. She lifted it carefully, and noticed a faint tear along the hem, as though someone had tugged too hard, or tried to hold on too tightly. This was no accessory from Eleanor's current wardrobe. It belonged to another time, another person. Jessica folded it back into its tissue, slower than before. There was a story sewn into that scarf, one that had unraveled just enough to let something slip free. Jessica sat quietly by the window, the box of belongings closed again beside her. From the garden below, she could hear the faint scrape of Holden's rake against gravel. Life outside the room moved on with a kind of indifference, as it often did after death. But inside, in this curated little chamber of the past, Jessica felt the weight of something unfinished. Eleanor Wexley had not lived untouched. She had loved, she had grieved, and she had made decisions that hardened into silence. She thought of the photograph, the unnamed man beside a younger Eleanor, the journal entries, the scarf, the letters never sent. Jessica had known many women like her, elegant, composed, and determined to carry the burden of their own mistakes in silence. Women who left clues not to be discovered, but simply because they no longer had the strength to erase them. Clara, for her, a blue scarf with a torn edge. Eleanor hadn't simply died, she had left a shape behind, the outline of a life not lived as fully as it could have been, not a victim, no, but a woman who knew that absence could echo louder than presence. Jessica stood slowly, there was more to find, and Eleanor's story, even in death, was far from finished. The garden at Wexley House stretched quietly behind the estate, clipped hedges, dormant shrubs, and rows of old roses waiting for spring. Jessica followed the gravel path until she found Mr. Holden by the southern beds, trimming thorny canes with careful precision. He didn't look up when she approached, though she knew he'd heard her. The secateurs clicked rhythmically. Snip, tut, snip. A ritual, not a task. Roses in winter, Jessica said softly, always seem to be waiting for something. He paused then, glanced at her. They wait for warmth, he said simply, and know it will come. She nodded, stepping closer. I imagine you've cared for this garden a long time. 32 years. The words were spare, but they carried weight. Not just time, history. Jessica studied him, a man with coal-used hands and a face that had weathered more than sun. You must have known Mrs. Wexley well. I knew her garden. Jessica let the silence linger. He bent to cut a dying stem and said no more. But his shoulders, square, unmoving, gave her the answer she needed. Mr. Holden did not waste words. And some truths, Jessica knew, grew quietly in the soil before anyone dared to speak them aloud. Jessica knelt beside the frost-bitten herb bed and ran her gloved hand gently through the brittle leaves. Holden stood a few feet away, still tending the roses, his back as straight as the wrought-iron fence behind him. You must have seen many seasons pass through this place, she said, her voice mild. Enough to know the patterns don't always repeat. She glanced at him. You mean the weather? His shears stopped. Not just the weather. Jessica stood. Forgive me for asking, but you seem to have known Eleanor not just as an employer. Holden met her eyes for the first time. They were grey and unreadable, like a pond gone still. We were young once. That's all. She didn't push, but something shifted. The soil had loosened, just a little. She had a fondness for white camellias, he added, even though they rarely bloom here. I noticed one blooming early, near the bench in the east garden. He nodded, slowly. That was hers. I planted it the year her husband passed. She never asked for flowers in the house after that. Jessica's thoughts turned to the scarf, the one found around Eleanor's neck. A white camellia had been tucked into the knot. She stopped asking, Holden repeated, but she never stopped looking for them. It wasn't romantic, the way he said it. It was reverent. And Jessica understood. Some devotions aren't spoken aloud because they were never meant to be shared. The rhythm of Holden's work slowed as Jessica stood quietly beside him, the sky shifting to a dull pewter overhead. She hesitated, then spoke. She's gone. He didn't flinch. He only set the shears down gently on the bench beside the climbing rose. I know. Jessica waited. She died in that chair, he said after a moment, like she was only resting. You saw her? No. His voice was low, but I knew the minute the wind changed. This house loses something when she's not in it. Jessica studied his face, the way the lines deepened near his eyes, how his gaze never wavered from the soil. She meant something to you. She was the kind of woman who could break your heart without raising her voice. Jessica said nothing. She didn't cry when her husband died, not once, just started walking through the garden like it was a foreign country. Holden reached for the shears again, then stopped, his hand hovering. People think grief makes you loud, he said, but it's the quiet that stays. Jessica's breath caught at the weight of the words. This wasn't fresh mourning, it had been buried for years, and now she realized it was beginning to resurface. They walked together slowly toward the east side of the garden, where the white camellia bloomed beneath a tall, bare-limbed beech. A weathered wooden bench stood nearby, its paint long since peeled. "She used to sit here," Halden said, "every Sunday after lunch, even in winter." Jessica sat, folding her gloved hands in her lap. Halden remained standing, but his stance softened. "This was where she told me it would never be anything more." Jessica turned to him gently. "You loved her." He didn't deny it. "She was married. I was the gardener." He shrugged, but it wasn't a casual gesture. Those things meant something then. "And after her husband died, she changed," he said. Something inside her locked shut. You could see it in the way she walked, how she kept her hands folded in her lap even when no one was watching. Jessica recalled the photograph, the younger Eleanor, smiling beside a man who wasn't her husband. Did she ever speak of a woman named Clara? That gave him pause. "She said the name once," he said finally. "The year Margot turned 16. Just once. She was angry, scared maybe. I didn't ask." Jessica nodded slowly. There were stories here, old and folded tight. But time had worn the creases, and with Eleanor gone, those folds had begun to loosen. They passed through the garden shed on their way back to the main path, a cluttered space filled with shears, coiled hoses, and pots stacked precariously. Jessica paused by a small shelf where an old tin box sat among trowels. A gleam of brass caught her eye. She reached for it. It was a small key, not ornate, but distinct, long-necked. Old, Halden noticed. That belonged to her. Jessica held it up. "Eleanor?" He nodded. "She gave it to me years ago. Said it opened the cabinet in the west corridor, the one no one used." Jessica recalled the scratches on the cabinet lock, the strange tension between Mrs. Tatlow and Halden. "Why did she trust you with it?" Halden hesitated. "She said if she ever forgot something, I'd know where to find it." "Did you?" "I put the key away. She never asked for it again." Jessica examined the key, tarnished around the teeth. It hadn't been used in some time, but something about its rediscovery unsettled her. If Halden had the key all along, why had the cabinet shown signs of forced tampering? Someone had needed what was inside badly enough not to wait for it to be opened properly. Jessica leaned against the doorframe of the shed, the key still resting in her palm. "Did you hear anything strange the night Eleanor died?" she asked quietly. Halden didn't meet her eyes. "I was out back. Storm was rolling in. Just wind. There wasn't a storm." He exhaled slowly. "That's what I told myself. But I did hear something." "What?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "A creak, like the east gate swinging shut. It was after midnight." "Did you check?" "No. I thought maybe one of the house cats." Jessica didn't believe him, not entirely, but something about it stayed with you. He nodded. "It wasn't the sound, it was the timing. The garden doesn't stir that late unless someone's walking it." Jessica held his gaze. "You're not telling me everything." He looked down. "I've already told you more than I should." Silence settled between them again, not hostile, but protective. He wasn't trying to deceive her, he was trying to shield something, or someone. Jessica pocketed the key. "If you remember anything else, I'll let you know." She stepped outside. But even as she walked away, she knew Halden's story was only half unearthed, and something buried still held tight to its roots. As Jessica passed the eastern bench once more, her eye caught the white camellia again, full and open, petals luminous against the faded greenery. It was far too early in the season. She stepped closer. The bloom was fresh, dew-beaded. It hadn't survived the winter. It had arrived despite it, just like the one tucked into Eleanor's scarf. Coincidence was always possible, but Jessica had spent her life untangling such coincidences, and knew too well that flowers don't bloom for no reason. Someone had placed it there, and someone had wanted it to be found. Jessica sat by the small window in her guest room, watching the wind lift leaves from the garden paths below. The house felt quiet again, too quiet, but her thoughts were anything but still. She couldn't shake the image of Eleanor by the fire, the ivory scarf wound neatly at her neck. It was more than unsettling. It was wrong. Something about it nagged at her, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refused to form. Not just the scarf itself, but the choice of it. Eleanor had never worn anything quite so pale in all the time Jessica had known her. Her colors were deeper, bolder, shades with weight, purpose, and precision. Jessica frowned and reached for her notebook, flipping back to a scribbled note from the evening before Eleanor's death. Dinner, plum silk scarf. She tapped her pen once, then again. The memory was clear. Eleanor had worn something rich and soft around her neck that night. Not ivory, not even close. So why had she been found in something entirely different? And more importantly, when had the switch occurred? Jessica stood, suddenly certain of one thing. The scarf hadn't been a detail, it had been a message, and someone had wanted her to read it. The dining room the night before Eleanor's death had been dimly lit, but Jessica could still recall the way the soft plum scarf had caught the light. A subtle sheen, almost violet, draped perfectly across Eleanor's collarbone. A deliberate choice, matched with pearl earrings and a dark amethyst brooch. Jessica didn't trust the tricks of memory, but this image stood out with unusual clarity. Plum silk, distinct, intentional. She leaned against the mantel in the study, letting her thoughts untangle. It wasn't just that Eleanor had been wearing a different scarf at dinner, it was that the scarf found on her body had never been seen before that morning, draped delicately, as if placed by someone who understood its weight, its symbolism. So what had happened to the plum scarf? Jessica closed her eyes, retracing the hours between Eleanor's final public appearance and the discovery in the sitting room. There had been no mention of a change of clothing, no signs of disarray, and Eleanor was not a woman given to haphazard wardrobe decisions. A single thread of certainty pulled taut in Jessica's mind. That ivory scarf hadn't simply replaced the plum one, it had erased it. Jessica made her way to the west hallway, where a linen cabinet stood nestled between two guest rooms. The corridor smelled faintly of polish and dried lavender. She found Mrs. Tatlow just coming up the stairs, holding a stack of folded sheets. Mrs. Tatlow. Jessica began gently, "Do you mind if I look at the scarves in Eleanor's wardrobe? There's something I'd like to check." The housekeeper hesitated, her hands tightening slightly around the linens. "They've not been touched since the day. I won't disturb anything. I'm just curious." Mrs. Tatlow led her to the master suite without another word. The cedar wardrobe creaked faintly as it opened, revealing a row of carefully hung clothing, all arranged by color. Beneath them, in a drawer lined with faded blue felt, were Eleanor's scarves, neatly folded, sorted by tone. Jessica counted them slowly. Navy, wine, emerald, plum. 3 were missing their matches. Did Eleanor lend her scarves to anyone? Never, Mrs. Tatlow said. She was quite particular. Jessica pulled the drawer open further. A slight gap. One scarf was clearly missing from the middle of the plum-toned stack. She stepped back slowly, her thoughts sharpening. The plum scarf hadn't been misplaced, it had been removed. Later that afternoon, Jessica found Lucian in the morning room, cataloguing correspondence with meticulous care. He was always precise. She'd noticed, never disheveled, never unaware. "I wanted to ask you about something small," she said, easing into the chair opposite him. He looked up. "Of course. The scarf Eleanor wore to dinner, the plum silk. Do you recall seeing it afterward?" Lucian's pen paused just briefly before he answered. "I remember the scarf, yes, but I don't believe I saw it again." Jessica watched him. "You helped prepare her room the following evening, didn't you?" "I laid out her night things, yes, but I didn't assist her directly." "Did she change after dinner?" Lucian's hesitation was brief, half a breath. "I assume she did, but you didn't see her do so." "No," he said, setting his pen down. "Eleanor valued her privacy." Jessica folded her hands. "And yet her scarf, the one she was wearing, is missing, replaced with one no one seems to have seen before." Lucian's gaze lowered. "Perhaps someone took it, out of sentiment." Jessica said nothing. There had been no sentiment in the knot that held that scarf around Eleanor's neck, only intention, and perhaps remorse. Jessica wandered back toward the guest wing. The corridor was quiet, the hush of afternoon, settling like a breath held too long. She stepped into the room across from her own, the one Margot had used when she first arrived, and paused before the standing mirror in the corner. It faced the hall at just the right angle. From where she stood now, Jessica could see her own reflection, and beyond it, the shadow of the master suite door. She remembered it now, clear as crystal. The night before Eleanor's death, Jessica had come out to retrieve a shawl from her own room. As she passed the mirror, she had caught the briefest glimpse of Eleanor in the hall, walking toward her bedroom, and around her neck, unmistakably, had been the plum scarf, not the ivory one. Jessica stared at the mirror now, its silvered edges mottled with age. It wasn't conclusive, not on its own, but it was enough to convince her Eleanor had not changed scarves after dinner. Someone else had changed her, afterward. The scarf was not a choice she made, it was a choice made for her. Jessica stepped out into the garden with a quiet purpose, crossing the gravel path until she reached the camellia bush beneath the beech tree. Its petals were still fresh, still white. Too white. She knelt, gently plucking one fallen bloom, and holding it in her palm. It was a rare variety. Eleanor had favored them, yes, but only Mr. Holden tended them, and they bloomed late, if at all, in this chill. She returned to the sitting room, where the ivory scarf still rested under Evident's care. Within its folds, preserved beneath a layer of muslin, was the single camellia. Jessica held the fallen bloom beside it. Identical, not just in species but in origin. The tiny notch along the petal's edge, the faint blush at its base, they were grown from the same hand. She stood in the stillness of the room, listening to the ticking clock, her thoughts pressing in. Someone had taken that flower from the garden, fresh, intentional, and placed it in Eleanor's scarf, an act of memory, a message, or a farewell. Jessica set the flower down. She now had two things she hadn't had before, a timeline, and a question no one wanted to answer. Jessica returned to her room in the fading light of day, her thoughts turning in quiet circles. The scarf, the flower, the absence of the plum silk, the faint bruising at Eleanor's neck, none of it pointed to chance. She sat by the fire, letting the silence gather, and slowly began to reorder what she knew. Eleanor had died in a position of peace, but nothing about it was peaceful. The scarf wasn't hers. The camellia had bloomed too early. Her personal items had been tampered with. Someone had tried to create an image, a tableau, as if death could be softened by symmetry, but there had been grief in the folds, not love. Someone had made Eleanor's final hour into a ritual. Jessica folded her arms, staring into the fire. There was no accusation yet, no confrontation, but something had changed. She would not ask questions the same way, would not smile as kindly. Not until she knew who had touched Eleanor last, and why. Outside her window, the wind moved through the camellias again, and this time, Jessica was certain it was not the season turning. It was the truth. Coming closer, the morning room was still, the curtains only half drawn. Pale light washed over the floral wallpaper and dulled the edges of everything it touched. Jessica paused in the doorway, her gaze settling on Lucian, seated alone near the window. He cradled a porcelain teacup in both hands, though the tea inside had long since gone cold. He wasn't drinking, only holding it, as though its warmth still lingered in memory if not in truth. Jessica stepped in quietly. "You haven't touched it." Lucian didn't look up. "It was meant for her," he said softly. "I poured 2 cups. It was a habit." She sat opposite him, the silence between them easy, almost companionable. Lucian's posture was composed but taut, his shoulders drawn slightly inward, as though guarding against something unspoken. "She was difficult to know," he said at last, "but not difficult to serve." Jessica studied him, "And yet you remained." He nodded once. "Because there are some people who make you feel that serving them is the closest you'll ever come to loving them." Jessica said nothing. The truth of it needed no reply. Outside, a bird called briefly, then fell silent. The tea remained untouched, and so did Lucian. Lucian set the cup down on the table with a delicate clink. His fingers lingered on the rim, as if parting from it was a decision he had to make. "I came to her when I was 24, he said. "Fresh from university, I had ideas, plans for publishing, editing, all the usual ambitions." Jessica tilted her head. "And yet you stayed here." "She asked me to organize her papers," he said, eyes unfocused. "Just for the summer. I never left." He gave a small dry smile. "It's strange, isn't it? Devotion doesn't feel like a trap while you're living inside it." Jessica watched him closely. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet ache. "I didn't love her the way people assume," he said, "but I admired her, respected her. She was a force, and when you serve someone like that long enough, you begin to believe their silence is a kind of approval." Jessica considered that. "Did she ever say thank you?" Lucian looked down. "Not in words, but once she gave me a book. First edition. No note, no occasion. That was the thank you." He nodded. Some affections, Jessica thought, were never named aloud, but they lived on the shelf just the same. Jessica reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, thick paper, the edges worn. She placed it gently on the table between them. Lucian looked at it, his brow furrowed. "It was in her desk," Jessica said, "unsent, addressed to you." He hesitated, then picked it up with careful fingers. As he unfolded it, his breath caught, a quiet hitch in his throat that told her more than any word might have. He read silently. When he looked up, his eyes were rimmed with red. "I didn't think she knew." "Knew what?" He placed the letter back on the table, smoothing it once. "That I stayed because I had nowhere else to go." Jessica waited. "She wrote," he whispered, "that I gave her dignity, that I made her feel less alone." He closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't think she'd noticed." Jessica touched his hand lightly. Just for a moment, she noticed. Lucian's shoulders trembled once, then stilled. He had waited years for those words, and they had come too late, as such words so often do. But in the stillness that followed, Something unspoken was finally acknowledged. And Jessica knew this was not a man with blood on his hands, only sorrow. Lucian sat back, his voice quieter now, as if memory itself had become too large to hold upright. "It happened a week before," he said. "Late. I'd brought her a glass of water. She was in the study, sitting alone in the dark." Jessica listened, her eyes steady. She didn't hear me come in at first. Her shoulders were shaking, not sobbing, just trembling. He paused. I'd never seen her like that. Eleanor didn't cry. She withstood things, loss, illness, disappointment. She met them all in silence. "What did she say?" Lucian stared into the middle distance. "She said, I built a life out of control, but I lost everyone I meant to protect." Jessica felt that line echo through her. Did she mention a name? She said something about a letter she hadn't written, that she had left things undone, that her choices had narrowed, and none of them felt just. Lucian rubbed his hands together. "I thought she was just tired, grieving. But now," Jessica leaned in, "now you think she knew something was coming." He looked up at her, pain and clarity mingling in his gaze. Or someone. There it was, the crack in the wall. And Jessica knew this wasn't just regret, it was warning. Lucian rose and crossed the room slowly, walking to the credenza near the window. From a drawer, he withdrew a folded piece of fabric, plum silk, smooth and slightly creased. Jessica stood. "That's it. The one she wore to dinner," Lucian confirmed, voice thin. "She wasn't wearing it when she died." "I know," he said, holding it with both hands. "She left it in the study that night, draped over the back of her chair. I found it the next morning." Jessica frowned. "You didn't return it to her?" Lucian shook his head. "She hadn't worn it again, and I thought perhaps, I don't know, that she wanted it gone." He looked at the scarf, as if it might answer for him. "I moved it to the linen drawer in the wardrobe." Jessica's breath caught, but it wasn't there when I looked. His brow furrowed. "It should have been. And the ivory scarf." Lucian hesitated. "I don't know where it came from, but it wasn't hers. She hated pale colors, said they washed her out." Jessica gently took the plum scarf from his hands. "She didn't choose that scarf," she said. "Someone else did." Lucian nodded slowly, and Jessica's certainty deepened. Someone had erased Eleanor's last truth with silk. Jessica turned the scarf over in her hands, the fabric catching what little light remained in the room. "You didn't harm her, Lucian," she said gently. He didn't answer right away. "But you helped conceal something." Lucian lowered himself back into the chair with a quiet exhale. "Not intentionally." She waited. "I saw her just after dinner," he said. "She was distracted, unsettled. Something had happened. She asked me to bring her tea and then left the room." "Did she return to the sitting room alone?" "I thought she had, but I wasn't sure." Jessica folded the scarf, letting the silence work. Someone else was in the house that night. Someone who wanted to make it look peaceful, but not kind. Lucian's face stiffened. "I didn't know what to do. When I found the scarf missing, I thought maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe I was imagining everything." "You weren't." He looked up at her then, a mix of relief and shame in his expression. "You're not responsible," Jessica said. "But you were close enough to see what others missed." Lucian nodded, almost imperceptibly, and Jessica knew he hadn't withheld the truth. He had simply waited too long to believe it. Jessica rose, offering a quiet farewell. Lucian remained seated, the now cold cup of tea still untouched beside him, hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't ask what she would do next. He didn't need to. As Jessica stepped into the hall, she glanced back. He was still there staring at nothing. Not out of confusion, but as though watching a shadow that refused to move. Some griefs softened over time, others simply carved themselves into the walls we walked through every day. And as Jessica walked away, she wondered how many more years Lucian would spend speaking to someone who could no longer answer. Jessica walked the upper hallway one last time, her steps quiet on the carpeted floor. Wexley House no longer whispered with its usual hush. It was emptier now, and not only because its matriarch was gone. It felt as though the very air had shifted, as if the house were exhaling something long held in. Doors stood ajar that had once remained closed. The scent of garden roses had faded, replaced by the clean, unfamiliar tang of wood polish. Footsteps, once deliberate and restrained, now moved with a kind of restless uncertainty. A home built on routine had lost its rhythm. Jessica paused by the doorway to Eleanor's study. The chair was still there, the fireplace cold. She thought of the scarf, the flower, the quiet grief folded into every corner of the house. None of it had been dramatic, but all of it had mattered. She descended the staircase slowly. Mrs. Tatlow passed her in the foyer with a nod, less stiff than before. Lucian's voice murmured somewhere behind a closed door. Wexley House would endure, of course, but something central had left it, and not just Eleanor. It was the silence that now lingered that told her. Something deeper had departed too. Sergeant Mallory stood near the front entrance, arms crossed, a man both waiting and withholding. Jessica joined him without announcement. The light filtering through the glass panes above the door gave his features a weary cast. "You're not staying for the formal inquiry?" he asked. She shook her head. "There won't be much to uncover. Nothing visible, anyway." Mallory nodded. "Still, it doesn't sit right." Jessica studied him a moment, then said quietly, "Not all endings require a name, even if there was intent." "There was grief," she corrected gently, "and sorrow left to sour." "I don't believe it was cruelty." Mallory looked at her. "But someone made a choice." "Yes," Jessica said, "but not to kill. To preserve an illusion of dignity, or maybe closure, and they nearly succeeded." He was silent for a moment, then offered her a slow, knowing nod. "You're not submitting a statement. I believe you already know what matters." He looked away, toward the garden beyond the window. "So do I." Jessica placed a hand briefly on his arm. "No accusations, no arrests. Just the ache of understanding that sometimes justice isn't the same as punishment, and some truths are better left known but unnamed." Margot stood by the fireplace in the drawing room, arms folded across her chest as the solicitor closed the folder and gathered his things. His voice had been dry, efficient, a man used to disappointing expectations. "You're receiving the bulk of the estate," he had said. But Margot hadn't smiled. Jessica approached her now, cautious in her silence. Margot didn't look up. "She left you more than you thought," Jessica said gently. "Yes," Margot replied, her voice low, "and less than I wanted." Jessica tilted her head. "Which part do you mean?" Margot sighed. "The explanation. The why. I thought if I got the house, the money, it would mean she trusted me, or forgave me. But it just feels hollow." "She didn't leave the truth in the will," Jessica said. "But she left it in the spaces, in the things she didn't say." Margot finally turned to her. Her face was dry, but her eyes were raw. "She was never kind to me. I think she wanted to be, but she didn't know how." Jessica offered a soft smile. "Then perhaps the inheritance is not what she left you. Perhaps it's what you choose to do with it." Margot didn't reply, but something in her expression began to shift. The morning had grown brighter as Jessica stepped into the garden once more. Mr. Holden stood by the camellia bush, hands tucked behind his back, watching the petals shift in the wind like pages turning themselves. She walked toward him without haste. "I suppose this is farewell," she said. He nodded but didn't speak. The camellia behind him swayed once, a single white bloom catching the sunlight. "She loved this garden," Jessica added. "She needed it," Holden murmured. It was the only place she didn't have to explain herself. Jessica studied him. "And you? Will you stay?" He glanced at the manor, then back at the flower. "I've been pruning away what was dead for most of my life. Maybe it's time I let something grow." There was no bitterness in his tone, only resolution. Jessica extended her hand. He shook it, firm but gentle. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. He met her gaze. "I saw enough." They didn't speak further. Some understandings, like certain flowers, don't need tending once they've bloomed. As she walked away, Holden turned back to the bush, and the white camellia, impossibly out of season, kept blooming, as if for her and her alone. Jessica returned to her guest room one final time. The suitcase was packed, the windows cracked open just enough to let in the crisp scent of late winter. She crossed to the writing desk where the folded plum scarf waited, its color soft, regal, familiar. She picked it up once more, letting the silk run through her fingers. It still carried Eleanor's perfume, faint now, like a voice growing quieter in memory. Jessica sat briefly and smoothed the fabric across her lap. It wasn't evidence anymore. It wasn't even a clue. It was a remnant of identity, of pride, of something that had belonged to the woman beneath the widow. She folded it carefully, slowly, with a kind of reverence, then placed it in the center of the desk, not tucked away in a drawer, not taken as a keepsake, just left, visible, waiting. Whoever walked into that room next would see it. Maybe Margot, maybe Lucian, maybe no one for weeks. But Jessica believed someone would pause when they saw it. And maybe they'd understand the difference between being remembered and being understood. She stood, took a last look at the scarf, and left the room quietly. Nothing else needed to be said. Jessica waited by the front steps, her bag at her feet, the morning sun climbing slowly behind the ridgeline. The car was on its way, but she didn't mind the pause. It gave her time to think, time to feel the quiet around her. Not the awkward hush of the first day, but something softer now. Grief had opened the house, and in that opening things had emerged. Regret, yes, but also truth. She thought of Eleanor's silence, how it had shaped the lives around her like stone worn smooth by years of water. Jessica had seen it before, women who loved too deeply to speak plainly, who left their real lives folded between lines and locked drawers. Lucian, too, had been shaped by that silence. So had Margot, and perhaps most of all, Holden, whose devotion had bloomed, year after year, with no one to name it. Jessica sighed, not out of weariness, but out of understanding. Love, when not shared aloud, doesn't vanish. It distills. It lingers in the fabric of a scarf, the root of a flower, the draft of an unsent letter, but when left too long, it turns into bitterness, into loneliness, or worse, into silence, mistaken for peace. The car arrived with the quiet rumble of gravel under tire. Jessica handed the driver her bag and settled into the back seat. The window rolled down just enough to let in the cool air. Wexley House receded slowly behind her, the iron gate swinging shut with a gentle groan. Its silhouette lingered in the distance, the high chimneys and climbing ivy etched against the pale blue sky. She didn't look away immediately. She let the image hold. How many stories, she wondered, begin not with a body, but with something softer, a scarf that doesn't belong, a flower blooming too soon, a whisper behind a closed door. This one had started that way, and it had ended, not with a confession or a verdict, but with a deep sigh of truth, sad, quiet, and entirely human. Jessica turned her gaze forward as the car picked up speed. Another village would come, another letter, another silence waiting to be filled. But Eleanor's story had closed now, not solved perhaps, but settled, and Jessica knew, sometimes the hardest mysteries to understand are the ones people never meant to leave behind. Some endings arrive not with thunder, but with a hush, like a door closing softly on a chapter no one quite knew how to finish. But I wonder, was it truly guilt that silenced them all, or simply the fear of being misunderstood? Tell me what you think. Was justice served, or was something more precious lost along the way? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story stirred something in you, do take a moment to like the video, share it with a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more quiet puzzles and hidden truths.